47. The retreat continued through that night and into the next day, and then the next day, and the next, until the periods of daylight and darkness melded together in a blur of fatigue and fear. Some people dropped out and were captured. Some were killed by the thinning cloud of their comrades who had now joined Vost. Some just drifted away from the column and never returned. And still the retreat went on. They began to climb away from the broad river that had been home to the humans and the Tatate. The triple canopy rainforest gave way to mixed deciduous coniferous growth. The heat of the great valley gave way to cool air by day and sharp chill at night. And still the retreat continued. Dakota rode in his place on the Locust's exterior, Jacobs and Goodall in the cramped cockpit where they could change places to keep the mech in continuous operation. They disregarded all but the most serious warning lights, knowing that redundant systems would keep the mech going for at least a little longer. In daylight, the length of the column shrank under the pressure of the pursuers and the prodding of Takuda and the rest of his desk team. More and more of the Tatate crowded to the front where they clustered around the Locust, remaining there when the cavalcade ended during the night. They became a source of inspiration to the mech pilots. They got to know, on an intimate and familiar basis, many of the Tatate who plodded along beside them. They watched as the aliens became more and more fatigued. They watched as the little bird humans shared the burden of the trek. They gave many of them nicknames like Bouncy, Happy, Springboard, Dumbo. They watched as some collapsed and were laid to their final rest, covered by whatever flowers grew in the area. When Arsenault went down with a spear thrust through his hips, the Tatate carried him. Paul Tesseract, a refugee from Osio, picked up Arsenault's laser rifle, but found that the full charger rig and rifle were too heavy for him. A Tatate carried the charger. Together the two, human with rifle, Tatate with power pack, became inseparable. And always the Tatate would move ahead on the trail, clearing it of sticks and rocks to make the passage easier for the humans. By the time the last member of the column passed a point, the trail was as smooth as energy and imagination could make it. Takuda pointed out that a trail so well marked might make it easier for the humans to travel, but it also made it easier for their pursuers to follow. The Tatate then rushed to cover the trail with the sticks, branches, rocks, and boulders they had so laboriously removed only moments before. Takuda gave up. It looked like he was going to be an avatar for the Tatate, and there was nothing he could do about it. On the 17th day, they crossed from the forest to an area of scrub. The temperatures dropped and the winds howled down out of the gray northern sky to bite through the party's light, warm weather clothing. It became impossible for them to travel after dark because of the cold. The refugees, the desk people, and the Tatate huddled around tiny fires that gave more visual comfort than real heat. On the 21st day, they encountered the first snow. The lamb came less often, even as the ground became more open. The flight time from Usagumo to the head of the column became a real consideration as fuel and maintenance began to wear down its capabilities. The trekkers were 300 kilometers from the river, and even at 900 kilometers per hour, the time out and time back began to eat up the craft's precious fuel. The other mechs hung at the rear of the column, but they too began to feel the strain of the trek. It had been days since their technicians had been at them, and Seagrove spent much of his precious fuel shuttling people and parts from the base at the Usagumo bastion. He began to complain about being used as a truck driver. Vost was not amused. As far as the commander of the mercenaries was concerned, Seagroves was getting what he deserved. The pilot was too big for his britches, and it was nice to see him knock down a peg or two. Vost decided that the Lamb would remain with the other mechs on a regular basis, returning to the Usagumo base camp only as needed. Seagroves, as a reaction to his less and less frequent visits to the city, made each one count. He began to move his gold from its hidden storage caches around the bastion into lockers in the Lamb. The pilot wanted to be sure that at least part of his stash was safe. The extra weight in the forward portion of the Lamb meant that the pilot had to retrim the craft for every flight, but a slight manipulation of the trim tabs took care of the problem. Late on the afternoon of the 22nd day, Seagroves brought the Lamb in for a rougher than usual landing near the other mechs. As the days dragged by, the rest of Vost's people had become less and less willing to smooth out landing sites for the Lamb. It wasn't so difficult to bring the 50-ton machine down into a clearing, but it was always better to know that the ground had been swept of rocks and any unseen holes filled. The Lamb was a heavy, solid, well-armored machine, but the landing thrust was liable to pick up loose objects and hurl them around with significant violence. Foreign object damage to one of the Aviar-Tech 125s would be just as fatal as a direct hit from a PPC. Seagroves complained about the lack of diligence on the part of the Enclave forces still in pursuit. Vost had told him to take his FOD and stuff it. "Your problem," said Vost, with the sneer that had become a permanent expression on his face, "is that you're afraid to fly. All you ever do is gripe. I don't know why, but it seems that the longer you guys fly, the more your guts turn to water. I'm surprised they don't issue you pilots diapers to keep your uniforms clean. I'll bet Hoon spends more time cleaning your pants than she does maintaining the Lamb." Seagroves clenched his fists in frustration. "I'm a professional pilot, and I plan to stay alive as a pilot. When you're 4 kilometers above the surface of a planet, falling can be very permanent. It's one thing to fall over in one of your land-bound machines, but in the air, any mistake can be fatal. Having some FOD break a fuel lead or damage a heat sensor or trim control can be fatal. All you guys on the ground have to do is clean up a bit. Is that too much to ask?" "Flying a computer-assisted fly-by-wire Lamb isn't all that hard," Vost scoffed contemptuously. "Remember, I'm Lamb qualified too." "You think so? You think so? Having flown one once doesn't make you qualified. Here," said Seagroves, digging into a trouser pocket. "Here, take the security decoupling system. If you think it's so easy, you fly it." Seagroves flipped the interlock disconnect control pack into the air. Vost snatched it with an evil grin. "I will. And just to show you what a good guy I am, here's the interlock to the Panther. Have a good day." Vost turned on his heel and made his way to the access ladder. Seagroves watched as the other man climbed up the side of the Lamb and crawled through the hinged port in the belly of the hawk portion of the combination. The deposed pilot jumped clear as Vost fired up the propulsion unit and let the twin turbos wind to a high whine. Seagroves listened with an experienced ear, criticizing the revs as being too high for the needed maneuver. Vost had a lead foot. Then the Lamb blasted clear of the small field. Seagroves watched it rise in a near vertical climb, the AVR 125 screaming at full power. As he reached up to his right breast pocket to put the Panther interlock code package away, his fingers found something already there. He poked them in and withdrew the fuel warning light bulb. He shrugged and snapped the tiny globe into the bushes. Too bad. Inside the Lamb's cockpit, Vost began to remember what it was like to fly. He'd been a mech warrior more than half his life, and he knew the surge of raw power that came with driving a 50-plus ton articulated fighting battle mech across the terrain. But this feeling he hadn't experienced in years. To be absolutely free of the ground, to be able to do anything he wanted, to be a bird of prey. Wonderful. Rapture of the air. He rolled the Lamb onto its back and then brought it back to level, upright flight. He got the feel of the controls. He could fly by the seat of his pants. Instruments were unnecessary. Not for him the artificial horizon, the climb and dive indicator, the compass. He could feel the movement of the lamb under him. It was the good old days all over again. There was a sharp beeping from the secondary screen, and Vost adjusted the controls. The screen wasn't identical to the one in the Panther, but it was close enough. He twisted the tuning controls until a clear picture appeared. There below him, clear against the stark rock of the mountain, stood the rebel locust. Vost eased the lamb over into a shallow approach, watching as the sensors scanned the stationary mech. Information on the status of the enemy machine scrolled across the corner of the secondary screen as well as the main screen HUD. Vost concentrated. The first information was the target type and identification. He knew all that. Then came propulsion information and heat status. The 160 LTV plant was fully operational, and heat was well within normal operating levels. The sensors scanned the Bergen 7 chassis. A glitch. Now Vost really concentrated. The mech wasn't moving, not even twisting or elevating its torso. It was a sitting dead duck. He felt the surge of adrenaline pour through his body. A sure kill. He let the lamb drift into a wide circle to approach from the rear. And then, when he was almost directly over the crippled locust, he slammed the joystick into the left front corner of his cockpit. The lamb rolled over into a neat split S and came down like a thunderbolt. Inside the locust, Jacobs and Goodall had seen the lamb on their own sensors as soon as it had cleared the edge of the mountain. They'd worked frantically to free the jammed servo actuator, but the cold, the travel, and the limited maintenance made the effort futile. Given time and some judiciously applied heat, they'd be able to free the joint, but they had neither at this instant. In the cockpit of the Lamb, Vost let the targeting computer lock onto the Locust's center top. He jammed the throttle full forward, and the AVR Tech engines responded. Jet exhaust leaped 30 meters to the rear of the screaming Lamb. Inside the computer monitoring the status of various systems, the low fuel warning matrix registered the last of the jet fuel pouring through the massive turbos. It responded by sending electron impulses to the warning light on the dashboard directly in front of the pilot. 1 pulse a second, 60 to the minute, more than 3,000 in an hour. It would continue to respond this way until the fuel was replaced. Vost didn't see the light. There was no light. But he did feel the last of the fuel rush through the screaming engines. The control panel went red. Warning lights and klaxons howled in his ears, so loud that his teeth vibrated. He pulled back on the joystick, saw the target computer lose its lock on the Locust. Then the ground was rushing at him with incredible speed. The storage compartment over his left shoulder snapped open, and a golden goblet dropped against the dashboard. Then another, and another. He stared in disbelief. 5 kilometers away, Seagroves turned when he heard the engines shut down in mid-dive. He didn't see the impact, but the rising fireball and the shock waves a moment later told him what had happened. He reached into his pocket for the Panther interlock.